Dr. Walford, just before we look at the minutes of the 3rd of June meeting, you'd referred to Dr. Gunson's letter to the Chief Medical Officer.
Yes.
And so, just for the sake of completeness,
Sure.
and not to leave that as a loose end, we'll just look at that. It's NHBT 0001067. It's 9th of June 1983, and it was copied to you at the time, so it would have come to your attention. It sets out various matters relating to AIDS. The second paragraph begins, the etiology of the disease is not known, but there's a strong possibility that the syndrome is caused by a transmissible infectious agent. In this context, it's been implicated in transfusion of blood and blood products. And then he refers to other cases and the two potential cases within England. And then he says, although relatively few cases of AIDS have as yet been reported in this country, the significance of the condition with respect to the transfusion of blood and blood products are twofold. The first point he makes then is in relation to trying to prevent high-risk donors and refers to the leaflet, and I'll come back to that. You had some involvement, I think, in the early stages of the preparation of the leaflet, so we'll come back to that. And then over the page, and this, I think, may be what you had in mind earlier, his point 2 is this: approximately 1/2 of the factor VIII concentrate used in the treatment of haemophilia in England and Wales at present is derived from plasma imported from the USA. The press have been keenly interested in this aspect, and there is, in my view, no alternative to the continuation of this policy in the short term. Then he refers to the new post-March restrictions in the States. He says the importation of the product prepared before April 1983 is being carefully monitored. Do you know what he's referring to there?
I don't entirely know, but of course we were looking at that through Medicines Division to try and see what the stock position was.
And then he says in the medium term BPL is being rebuilt and refers to self-sufficiency. The necessity of an adequate supply of plasma from our volunteer donors to the new laboratory from the regional transfusion centres cannot be overemphasised. And then he goes on to talk about the Council of Europe. I'll come back to that, and press publicity. Now, it's clear from this letter that Dr. Gunson wasn't advocating a change of approach. Indeed, on the contrary, he sets out his view, no alternative to continuation of the policy in the short term. My question is a slightly different one, which is not to cast any doubt upon what you were saying Dr. Gunson's view was, as expressed contemporaneously to you at the time. My question is this: is there any material of which you're aware from this time in which the actual ability of regional transfusion centres to produce increased volumes of cryoprecipitate was assessed or investigated? In other words, is there anything in which someone's gone to each regional transfusion centre and said, what's your capacity to produce cryoprecipitate? How much do you produce? Could you produce more? If so, over what period of time? Would you need new equipment, or have you got the right equipment? Those kind of questions. Are you aware of that exercise having been undertaken?
No, I'm not directly aware of that having been done. Clearly, if that was done, I would suppose that the NBTS would have records of any requests that arrived or any discussions that were held, but I'm not personally aware. That's
fine, thank you. So if we then go to the meeting of the 3rd of June, which is at DHSC 0002229_030. And Dr. Walford, I'm conscious I went very quickly through the papers, but that's really in the interests of getting through your evidence. If there's any bit of the papers that we would need to go back to, do please let me know.
Thank you.
But I'm conscious you're familiar with them, not only having authored them at the time, but having recently reread them for the purposes of your evidence. So this is the meeting. Can I just ask, because we'll see what Ms. Spencer's intervention is, she's recorded as being from MB. What was MB?
It was part of Medicines Division.
So then if we look further down, paragraph 2 says, Mr. Parker explained that the meeting had been arranged to consider the implications for the department of recent media reports on AIDS and to examine possible courses of action. The first then is the AIDS leaflet, and we'll see in the second part of paragraph 3.
Just take a moment.
Thank you, sir.
I'm sorry, Dr. Walford.
Do you want to just repeat that question to make sure that Dr. Walford heard it?
Thank you.
Yes. We're just looking at paragraph 3. It refers to the leaflet, which I'll come on to. And then it says in the second part of the paragraph, it was felt that more positive steps should be taken at donor sessions, and it was recommended that RTD, so regional transfusion directors, should be asked to reconsider their decision not to question potential donors about the presence of symptoms such as night sweats, weight loss, etc. And if we go to the next paragraph, we can see that the minuted action is your approach, the chair of directors, to ascertain their views. And we'll look at your subsequent letter in a moment. I just want to see what the action was. I don't think I need to trouble you with looking at the liaison with the Medical Gay Society. We then come, bottom of the page, control of imports, and paragraph 7 looks at this issue of the dumping of pre-marked concentrates. And then we see Ms. Spencer explain that the effective application of legal restrictions would present significant practical difficulties. And my understanding, Dr. Walford, from your statement is that you don't know now what those practical difficulties were that she was referring to.
No.
And then it suggested that informal discussions with the companies concerned were more likely to lead to successful control. Now, we'll look very shortly at the minute you produce, setting out a range of questions that could be posed of companies and the answer that came back. Was that the action that was taken in relation to this suggestion of informal discussions, or were there?
I don't know. I mean, I believe my minute asking all those questions was really simply probing, as it were, as a result of all the discussions we were having. I just felt that there were a series of questions that we needed to know the answers to. Ms. Spencer would have been in a position to know what the legal problems were. I have no idea.
And if we go to the top of the next page, we can see it's agreed that Medicines Division and Supplies Division should instigate such discussion. Now, so those are not your division, as it were.
No.
Do you know what steps either of those divisions took?
Well, they were having discussions with the pharmaceutical companies, and I wouldn't have been privy to that unless somebody had chosen to give me some information as to what they had found. And it may be that in the answers to my email, my minute, wish there had been emails. It may be that in the answer to my minute from Dr. Fowler or Mr. Edgerton, that actually that was the result of some of the conversations. They had obviously held conversations. Yes.
I mean, that's really what I was getting at. Did you understand there to be something more by way of discussions being proposed here, or just the kind of discussions we see in the reflected in Mr. Edgerton's response to you?
No, I would have thought that was just the discussions that they were having with the pharmaceutical companies.
Then we get to paragraph 9, where you talk about, and I think we've really covered this territory already, Dr. Walford, your concern, or the concern about the consequences of controls on supply. Heat-treated products, the agreed action at paragraph 11 is to keep a close watch on developments. And then under the heading plasma supply and factor VIII production in the UK, there's a discussion about self-sufficiency and an action that is writing to the regional administrators at regional health authorities, reminding them of the benefits of self-sufficiency, pressing them essentially to keep supplying plasma. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And then if we go down the bottom of the page, we can see that there's reference to research. I don't propose to ask you anything about that. And then if we go to the top of the next page, we can see there's a discussion about the Council of Europe. There's a reference to Dr. Gunson's report. We'll look at all this shortly, Dr. Walford. The agreement is that when the opportunity to comment arose, the potential problems to the UK created by small pool production and the ban of imports should be brought to the Council's attention. And we'll, as we'll shortly see, you made comments on the draft recommendations
Yes.
that for Dr. Gunson to pass back to the Council of Europe delegates. And then there's a very short discussion recorded in relation to the redevelopment of BPL at paragraph 21. Again, I don't think I need to ask you about the entry under the heading homosexual rights groups. And then Haemophilia Society, the meeting acknowledged the part played by the society in keeping AIDS in perspective. Are you able to assist us with what's meant by that comment?
Well, it seems to be self-evident that essentially the Haemophilia Society was communicating with members and presumably trying to give them the information that they have, and indeed to keep the problem in whatever was the right perspective. But since I wasn't involved at all with what the Haemophilia Society was saying, and this is reported by somebody else, I really can't comment any further.
And you yourself weren't involved in looking at the materials that were being produced by the Haemophilia Society, which to some extent at this point in time were based upon what Professor Bloom was producing. You weren't involved in looking at those yourself?
Well, I don't think I ever received anything really contemporaneously. I wasn't involved with the Haemophilia Society. There will have, presumably, if any of the Haemofact documents, which I have now seen, were around in the department, I might well have seen them, but I wouldn't know, I wouldn't know when I had seen them.
And then we can see paragraph 26, Ms. Spencer reported the subcommittee of the Committee on the Safety of Medicine will be discussing AIDS on the 13th of July. So those are the matters that were discussed, the plan being to examine possible courses of action. I just really want to explore with you two matters to see whether you accept that these were not discussed and to see if you can assist us with why. The first is this, that there's no discussion evident from the minutes about any different approaches to the treatment of haemophiliacs. So there's no discussion about whether different policies should be adopted for those for different categories of haemophiliacs. There's no discussion about whether treatment should be minimised or no prophylactic treatment or cancelling non-elective surgery. It's right, isn't it? If there'd been such a discussion, we'd have seen some reflection of it in the minutes.
I would suppose so, but of course we would have been aware of any material that was being put out by the UK HCDO to its members to minimise. So, for example, not to treat mild haemophiliacs with concentrate, not to treat von Willebrand's disease with concentrate, and to treat children again with cryo if at all possible. So I think we will definitely have been aware that the Haemophilia Society was, the Haemophilia Centre directors were putting out that material, and it really would not have been for a meeting of officials to suggest any change in policy for treatment.
And does that, in terms of why that's the case, does that go back to the discussion, Dr. Walford, that we had on the first day of your evidence?
Yes.
The clinical freedom and the view that was taken, rightly or wrongly, and that may ultimately be a question for the chair, that it wasn't the role of the department to issue guidance or advice to clinicians.
That was exactly the situation on the ground at the time.
And then the second matter that we see no reference to in this meeting, or at least in the minutes, is any consideration of what patients were being told, other than perhaps that oblique reference to the part played by the society in keeping AIDS in perspective.
I don't think, I'm relying on the minutes in the same way as you are here, because I don't have anything else to go on. And obviously it's not particularly reported here. Dr. Gunson said in his letter to the CMO that patients were being informed. And one of the things that we do know about is that it was a question of informing those individuals who needed to know. The need to know was fundamentally with haemophiliacs as opposed to anybody else by way of patient group. And essentially, it would have been our understanding that the role of the haemophilia centre directors in looking after their patients would be to discuss this matter with them. So it wouldn't have been at all for the department, but it would have been for the haemophilia centre directors.
And again, I will want to come back to that issue, and we'll look at what Dr. Gunson said. And there's no discussion also of Dr. Galbraith's paper to Dr. Field in this meeting. Are you able to assist us with why?
It seems not.
But are you able to assist us with why that's the case?
No, Dr. Spellis was at this meeting, was she not?
She was indeed. Yes.
So basically that would have been an issue which, if it was going to be raised, I would have expected her to raise.
Then in terms of actions following this meeting, I just want to pick up on two of them then. The first is the suggestion that you'd approach the chair of the regional transfusion directors to ask them to reconsider what had been, I think, a very strong reluctance to be questioning donors.
Yes.
And we can see that at DHSC 0002231_051. So this is a minute from you dated the 6th of June, and you're updating Mr. Winstanley on the actions that fell to you from that meeting. And the first paragraph says, I've done the following. I've spoken with Dr. Wagstaff about re-ascertaining directors' views about the desirability or otherwise of asking donors about symptoms such as night sweats, unexplained weight loss, etc. He promised to write to all directors immediately to obtain their views. I explained that if directors still felt such questioning to be inappropriate, we would need to have a note of the reasoning which had led to this conclusion. Dr. Wagstaff felt that a possible compromise would be to add these questions to the list of questions which the donor reads from a card and then signs. The objection to this, Dr. Wagstaff felt, is that in his experience, donors either do not read or do not take in what is written on the card. So just pausing there, do you know what then happened in relation to this issue?
As far as I'm aware, they didn't ask questions about symptoms. I can't understand personally the reluctance, but nevertheless, there was a very strong feeling amongst regional transfusion directors that they wouldn't. Not only would they not ask about any possible symptoms, they also very particularly would not ask about any sexual habits or orientation.
And do you know whether you received the note of the reasoning that you'd requested?
No, I think I had. If we, is there anything else in this document?
Not on that issue.
Right.
There are some other issues, but again, it may simply be the volume of material hasn't been picked up, but I don't think you've referred to it there being any such note in your statement. Again, okay. I'm sure I'll be corrected if I'm wrong.
Could I ask you also, this meeting is the 3rd of June. Was that after the meeting? There was a meeting in May of regional transfusion directors that I attended, about the 18th of May,
we're checking all the regional transfusion director meeting minutes in the course of the morning, Dr. Walford. So if there is anything which casts any further light on this issue, we can come back to it in the course of the day. The next paragraph, you flag up the issue of how leaflets would be distributed. It's going to be a relevant issue when Lord Glenarvan gives evidence later in the week. So I just want to note that you've asked the question. Dr. Wagstaff prefers the handing out leaflets rather than the having them available, and he says he'll canvass directors' views on that alone. And then we can see in the next paragraph, Dr. Wagstaff asks about the possibility that Liberton, so the Edinburgh Centre, might be able to process some English plasma if American imports were to be restricted. And again, I'm not going to read everything out there, but there's a discussion about that. And then further down that paragraph, you say to Mr. Winstanley, doubtless you will wish to pursue this possibility with the Scottish Home and Health Department. Now, obviously, we looked at the earlier issue in relation to Liberton yesterday.
Yes.
Do you know whether anything further came of this suggestion that on a temporary basis, because of the situation in relation to AIDS, there might be the possibility of some additional processing of English plasma being done in Scotland?
I don't know as a result of this. Obviously, the action fell to Mr. Winstanley.
Right. Well, in that case, we'll try to take that up elsewhere. And then, if we then, so that those were some of the actions that fell to you from the meeting of the 3rd of June. In terms of the discussions with pharmaceutical companies, if we look at your minute at DHSC 0002229_041. It's a minute of the 14th of June 1983 from you to Mr. Edgerton. In which department or branch was Mr. Edgerton based? Was he supply?
I think he was supply. Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to go through each and every question, but you've set out there a range of questions that could possibly be posed of pharmaceutical companies. Mm-hmm. And then if we look at the a response at DHSC 0002229_055. It's dated the 28th of June 1983, and it's from, I think, Mr. Wrigglesworth, copied to you. And it refers to HSIB, so that's supplies, is it?
Yes.
Having circulated the questions listed in your minute to suppliers and possible suppliers of coagulation factor concentrates. And then then there's a summary of the replies, and we'll just look at the most material ones. So paragraph D identifies the 5 firms supplying blood products in the UK, and paragraph E sets out the rough volume of annual imports. F says, with the exception of Immuno, the firms state that they do not or have ceased to collect in epidemic areas, or state that their collection centres are FDA licensed. G, the plasma in each case is pooled prior to processing. In the case of Immuno products, European plasma and USA plasma are pooled separately. H, the origin of all plasma is identifiable. And then I, each is given the assurance that future sales will comply with FDA guidelines. However, Miles Labs state that the Factor VIII manufactured from plasma collected since March 83 will not be available until August, and Immuno in September 83. And then it says the 10th company, Qatar International Limited, have not yet replied. There's a table over the page. I'm not going to go through it, but just we can see that that's some of the information that was summarised in the on the previous page. So, is it right to understand that the outcome of these informal discussions was with the qualifications set out in paragraph I on that previous page? We just go back to it. The companies are saying that their future sales will be compliant with FDA guidelines, which might be thought to be a statement of the obvious. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't really address the issue of what had already been supplied to the UK and what might still be held either at NIBSC or in regional health authority areas.
Yes, I mean, in essence, it's telling us that actually there is no such plasma, no such product derived from post-March 23 plasma in the UK at the time, and that there are significant stocks amounting to many millions of international units of Factor VIII that are in the country, either waiting NIBSC clearance or ready for use.
And so, as a matter of fact, the overwhelming probability is that haemophilia centres continued to treat patients with pre-March plasma for a period of time.
That's right.
You previously pointed out that a number of the companies said that they had voluntarily adopted FDA-type regimes prior to the 24th of March 1983, and it's right to say the second page of this document has got some of the specific dates from some of the companies. So I just again, I'm not going to go through the detail, but just to complete the evidence you gave on that. Can we then come to the meeting on the 13th of July of 1983? Just to explore how that meeting came about, if we look at CBLA 5043_034, this is Dr. Joseph Smith's letter of the 28th of March 1983 to Dr. Keith Fowler in the Medicines Division at the Department of Health. He says that he thinks it would be advisable to consider at a meeting of the CSMB, and that's the Biological Subcommittee of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, the problem of AIDS in relation to licensed blood products, and he suggests it would be very helpful to have Professor Bloom there. And then there's a reference in the second paragraph to the action of the FDA. And then the request in the third paragraph to Dr. Fowler is to prepare a brief paper on which the discussion might be based. I think you say in your statement you didn't see this at the time.
No.
But you subsequently became aware, I don't think we need to look at it, in the latter half of April.
That's right.
Of this proposal. It doesn't appear, and I think you've had the opportunity to read the statement from Dr. Smith, now Sir Joseph Smith.
I got it late last night. I have glanced. No more than that.
Just to make it clear, I think we haven't asked you to read it because we're conscious of how much material that you have already processed. But it would appear from Dr. Smith's, Sir Joseph's statement that Dr. Galbraith's action on AIDS report to Dr. Field was not the trigger for the meeting, and indeed was not the focus of the meeting, albeit that Dr. Galbraith himself was present at the meeting.
That's my understanding too, from looking at this.
So if we then look at the materials that were available at the meeting, first of all, so the written materials, there are, I think, two documents that you've referred to in your statement, and Sir Joseph Smith confirms in his statement appear to have been the available documents. The first is a paper from Dr. Fowler at DHSC 0002229_059. And you referred to this yesterday or the day before,
Yes.
Dr. Walford, but we didn't, I think, in fact, look at it.
Yes.
We can see it's headed Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, a New Hazard for Haemophiliacs by Dr. L.K. Fowler. I can't remember if I've asked you this, Dr. Walford, and apologies if I have. What was Dr. Fowler's area of clinical expertise? Do you know?
Yes, I think clinical expertise, I don't know, but I think his responsibility in Medicines Division was to report to Dr. Holgate on blood and blood products.
But you don't know what his clinical background is. And then if we go over the page, we just ask you to note, and you've reflected it in your statement, at the very bottom of the second page, and then in where he refers to the last two lines, the most convincing hypothesis so far for the etiology of AIDS is advanced by Sonnabend et al. And then top of the next page, in that first paragraph, he expands upon that, and at the end of the first paragraph, he poses the question, in a word, is it not possible that haemophiliac AIDS may be a function of the concentrate itself rather than a specific agent transmitted by homosexuals with or incubating AIDS? So he was, if I can put it this way, speculating that AIDS might not be caused by a transmissible agent and a viral infection, a different cause, albeit still linked to concentrates.
Yes.
Be that as it may, he then goes on to say, having said this, one cannot ignore other views and hope that the problem will go away. The media concept of a ticking time bomb is a very real one for haemophiliacs, and no effort should be spared to protect them by all practical means. And then he refers to the precautions taken so far based upon a single unknown virus hypothesis. Presumed agent is unknown, can't be tested for. He refers to exclusion of blood from donors with positive tests will remove many homosexual donors who it said tend to be good citizens, and suggests perhaps there could be an appeal to homosexuals to exclude themselves voluntarily from blood donations and so on. And expresses a concern about the alienation of donors. And then if we go to the next paragraph, he says there's some evidence that cryoprecipitate made from single donations or very small donor pools is safer than concentrate made from pools of thousands of donations. And then says the evidence is scanty. And was there any real doubt that cryoprecipitate, certainly if the transmissible agent view of etiology was the correct one, was there any real doubt that cryoprecipitate or very small donor pools were significantly safer than pools of thousands of donations?
I can't answer for whether there was any reasonable doubt. I mean, I think probably there were certainly publications about patients who'd been maintained on cryoprecipitate who also seemed to have abnormalities of their immune system, so that the T4, T8 lymphocyte ratio was not necessarily totally reversed, but was actually not what you would expect if the immune system was entirely intact. So, excuse me, there was a lot of information flying around as to whether or not patients maintained on cryoprecipitate were likely to be less likely to be affected, and whether their immune systems looked as if they were or were not being affected. So, but of course, Dr. Fowler said this, and not me.
No.
So,
and I'm asking you, Dr. Walford, frankly, because you were present at the meeting as an observer, not as a participant, and most of the people present at the meeting are not people who were involved and taking the decision, are not people we can ask about it. So I'm afraid it's by default, really, that I have to pose these questions of you rather than the central decision makers at the meeting. But anyway, if we pick it up at the bottom of the page, he says, even so, if a haemophiliac can be managed on cryoprecipitate alone, it clearly makes good sense to do so, since it will minimise the number of donors the patient is exposed to. And then over the page, he then goes on to talk about the problem of imported concentrate. More than half factor VIII concentrate used in the UK is imported from the US. How do we ensure that the risk of transmission of AIDS to haemophiliacs is kept as low as possible? And then he refers to the FDA regulations. And picking it up about halfway down that paragraph, he says, it behoves us to ensure that concentrate imported from the US was not prepared from plasma obtained prior to the implementation of the FDA recommendations. And then he says probably the best means for accomplishing this is by the system of stop orders. So that's consistent with his response to your minutes in May. So that's one of the two documents before the committee on the 13th of July. The second document is at DHSC 0001209. And it's a well, it might be said it's a somewhat curious document, and I'm going to explain to you why I put it in those terms, Dr. Walford, in a moment. But we can see it's called a suggested agenda for discussion on AIDS in relation to licensed blood products, and it's authored by Dr. Smith, dated the 28th of June 1983. He says the aim of the discussion is to help the subcommittee to formulate advice to the CSM on whether any action is needed, and if so, what action in respect of AIDS and blood products licensed under the Medicine Act. And then he refers to the various products. My focus, as you'll understand, is going to be on factor concentrates, sure, as opposed to immunoglobulin, albumin or hepatitis B vaccines. We can see then who's going to be invited to attend the committee in addition to its members. So it's Bloom, Crass, Galbraith, Gunson and Mortimer. Paragraph 3 is the assumption that participants will be familiar with the problem and with at least a proportion of the many publications. And then this agenda suggests headings for the discussion, and a suggested first speaker is given. As a target for discussion, brief possible conclusions are indicated. Doubtless these will be changed radically. And then what we can see then set out, as he says, is there's a subheading, there's a suggested speaker, and then there is what appears to be a conclusion formulated perhaps consistently with what he said in paragraph 4 as a target for discussion, but a suggested conclusion formulated by Dr. Smith. Now, I know you weren't involved with the putting together of this document at all, so it may be that you can't assist, but you were previously in the medicines division, and I think you previously prepared material for assessment of other products.
Yes.
Was this a normal way to proceed? Was this how meetings would normally, and discussions normally be structured?
It's difficult to say for me because basically as an assessor, it was quite a formulaic way of preparing your document for the committee to consider, and it was set out under certain set headings, if you like. So they would always have a well-prepared paper in front of them so that they didn't have to do, one got over all the having to talk to individual bits. So it's not totally abnormal to have something like this. I don't necessarily recall under each heading there would be a suggested conclusion, although he does say he suggested a conclusion which he thought might potentially be changed. But I mean, this is a fairly unusual format, I would say, but I can't just extrapolate from what I did, because what I did was actually to a formula in terms of how I presented cases to the Committee on Safety of Medicines.
And just so that we can get the flavour of how it's structured, if we go to page 3, and I take your point, Dr. Walford, that the assistance you might be able to give us in relation to this is limited. But we can see, so that others following can understand, if we look at paragraph 4, for example, under the heading Consideration of the different operational possibilities for reducing the risks from clotting factor preparations, the proposition is withdraw concentrates, i.e. use only cryoprecipitate. The proposed speaker is Professor Bloom, and then the putative conclusion is this step cannot at present be recommended and reasons given. And then we can see, if we look down the bottom of the page, under the heading, so the little Roman 3, that's right, thank you, use US blood products as sparingly as possible. So this might be the treatment techniques or treatment policy strategies that I've been ventilating with you in my questions, Dr. Walford. Note, this possibility is largely a matter for physicians treating haemophilia, but it could in theory be decided to modify product licenses, e.g. not for use in children with mild haemophilia. The proposed speaker to this proposition, as it were, is Professor Bloom, and the suggested conclusion is the uncertain balance of risk-benefit considerations in various categories of patients are too finely balanced to justify action via licensing. The matter should be left to clinical judgment. So, in any event, those are, as far as I think you understand, as far as we understand, the only two documents that the subcommittee had on the 13th of July.
As far as I'm aware, but I wonder if you could just take us to the section on epidemiology, because it says Dr. Galbraith to speak to that, and I just think I ought to look and see.
It does. It's we pick it up at the bottom of the first page.
The reason I'm asking is because I noticed, having seen the paper then from Dr. Smith, he asked for a paper on epidemiology to be produced by CDSC, and I'm surprised that the only paper that went was the Dr. Fowler paper, which is obviously not an epidemiological paper, and Dr. Smith's own paper. But Dr. Smith did ask for a paper on epidemiology to be produced, and he suggested, I think, that maybe Dr. Pollock of CDSC could produce it, and Dr. Galbraith was at this meeting. I cannot remember, and I haven't seen anything which allows me to remember what the conversations were, what was said, because there is none of that in any of the papers that I've seen. But Dr. Galbraith would have been at that meeting and expressing a view on the epidemiology. So I thought it would be quite interesting to see.
Absolutely. So The heading is Epidemiology, Current Position, Assessment of Risk from Factor 8. You're right, the suggested speaker is Dr. Galbraith. If we go over the page, the suggested conclusion is recipients of clotting factor concentrates are at risk. The degree of risk cannot yet be quantified. The risk is likely to be greatest from products derived from the blood of homosexuals and IV drug abusers resident in areas of high incidence and in those who repeatedly receive concentrates in high dosage. So I'm afraid that's all we have. And you're absolutely right to point out that Dr. Galbraith was there. The evidence doesn't appear to suggest that the paper that he'd sent to Dr. Field was expressly considered. Why, I think, must remain a mystery.
Shame. Yes.
Now, can I then take you, because I want to, again, really ask you about it because you were there and there were very few people I can ask, but I just want to take you then to the records of the conclusions, which is at DHSC 00012008. Dr. Walford, we haven't given you the minutes as well, but the content of the conclusions here is identical to the matters set out in the minutes. Mm-hmm. The minutes simply record, in addition, the formalities of who was present and who was observing and so on. And those representing you in any event have the minutes. But this is the document that then went to the Committee on the Safety of Medicines when it was effectively asked to say whether it agreed.
Yes.
So it's entitled Summary of Main Points from a Consideration of AIDS and Licensed Blood Products by CSMB, 13th of July 1983. And then if we go down to where it says the following conclusions were reached, and I don't need to ask you about all of them. One is about etiology. So the cause of AIDS is unknown, but an infectious etiology seems likely. A previously unrecognised or new agent may be responsible, and so on. So I don't think, I'm not going to ask you to go into to look further at the detail of that. 2, patients who repeatedly receive blood clotting factor concentrates appear to be at risk, but the evidence so far available suggests that this risk is small. Now, you, I know, were at the meeting as an observer. Do you have any independent recollection of what the content or shape of the discussion was on that occasion?
Absolutely nothing.
We see reference to the risk being small, however, appearing in other material, including some of your own background papers.
Yes.
Is it right to understand, at least from your perspective,
yes,
can't speak to what was in the mind of the committee members, I accept, that's based upon the numbers, was it? The numbers of known cases and the relatively small number of cases?
Yes, I think one can only say that's all we had to go on. It was a very data-poor position to be in. The only thing we knew at the time was the number of cases of AIDS, not the numbers of cases of infections, but the numbers of cases of AIDS that had appeared in haemophiliacs in America, and our own experience of the one case so far. I don't think we knew even about the man in Bristol at this time. We didn't know until September, I don't think. So that was effectively all there was to go on. We had no information about any level of infection that was not manifest as yet as AIDS, for example, nor indeed how many people who had become infected, if they had become infected, would ultimately go on to develop AIDS. So it was really, we had next to no information to go on. I suppose the thing that, obviously I've thought about this an awful lot, and we're probably going to come on to it in terms of things that I may have said at some stage later. But the one thing that is very interesting about this, and it's certainly interesting in relation to the information that was given in Spence Galbraith's paper, which is that AIDS appeared to have been diagnosed in America in a number of people in the late 70s, 78, 79. And yet by the time I think this group was meeting, I think there may have been 11 cases, some small number of cases in America in patients with haemophilia. And we had the one case in the United Kingdom. Given the ubiquity, the millions of units, as you pointed out, sir, that were actually going into patients with haemophilia, it seemed extraordinary, even allowing for a long incubation period, that there was such low numbers. Now, when I talk about such low numbers, nobody should take it as assuming I think that a few here and there was not significant. It was of colossal significance to the individuals concerned. But in looking at the data that we had, it was quite extraordinary. So much American factor VIII having been used over the years, and yet so few patients actually manifesting as cases of AIDS.
In terms of basing an assessment of risk on numbers of cases, albeit with the qualification that or explanation that you've just given, do you accept there's a possibility of conflating incidents with risk? Or?
Oh, totally, and it is what happened. It is what happened. I think you might say, yes, but what else was there to do? I mean, clearly a caveat should have been entered in each case, and I think quite often it was, but this may be the tip of an iceberg. This may be something which is going to explode and be an enormous problem. But it would have to be a caveat, since one didn't know, A, the level of infection that was around, B, how many infections would actually go on to become AIDS or manifest themselves in any of the symptoms that might be considered to be AIDS. So it was a total vacuum of information, and the only information that we had was numbers, totally inadequate though it was. And you're right, the risk and the numbers were conflated.
Now, if we just continue with that same paragraph, it talks about the risk appears to be the greatest in the case of products derived from the blood of homosexuals, IV drug abusers resident in areas of high incidence, and in those who repeatedly receive concentrates in high dosage, balanced against the risks of AIDS and of other infections transmitted by blood products, the benefits of their use. In the case of haemophilia, they are life-saving. Now, it's right, of course, to say that concentrates could be life-saving in the case of haemophilia. But are you able to assist us with understanding whether the committee thought that was, as it were, almost invariably the position? Because the majority of treatments, as I think we've already discussed, were to alleviate pain, joints, etc., but it's not an invariably life-saving treatment, is it?
I can't interpret for you what the committee thought, but I would, if I might suggest, I know that this inquiry has a group of experts on haemophilia who should be able to assist you with that and should be able to go back in history and in time to show you what the consequences of untreated or suboptimally treated haemophilia were. I think that inadequate treatment of haemophilia, severe haemophilia, was life-threatening. It didn't always mean that the patient would ultimately succumb, but there was a potential. I don't think that is an exaggeration, but I do feel that I'm not well placed to tell you, whereas I do think, sir, you have a committee of experts on haemophilia who should be able to assist.
The third, actually, sorry, just before I move on from that, of those participating in the meeting, whether as members of the committee or the handful of expert advisors, as they were termed, would it be right to understand that the person who would have been in a position to provide information to the committee about benefits of treatment would have been Professor Bloom?
He was the haemophilia expert that Joe Smith actually chose to assist the committee.
And the only haemophilia expert who participated in that meeting?
That's true, though Dr. Lane, who was a member of the committee, knew an awful lot about haemophilia.
Paragraph 3 then talks about possibility of withdrawing clotting factor concentrates, replacing with required precipitate. Included this was not feasible on grounds of supply, and I've canvassed that with you already, Dr. Walford. Top of the next page talks about the possibility of withdrawing US preparations from the UK. So there's an element of repetition there, but in any event, it goes on to talk about the perceived level of risk doesn't at present justify serious consideration of such a solution. Efforts are, however, being made to secure UK independence of foreign suppliers of clotting factor concentrates. This should reduce markedly, although not eliminate, the risks to recipients of these products, and the subcommittee strongly supports this aim. Now, that's talking about achieving self-sufficiency, as I understand it. Efforts being made to secure UK independence of foreign suppliers of clotting factor concentrates.
Yes.
I don't know whether in the limited time you've had to look at Sir Joseph Smith's statement, you picked up upon this, but his statement records his understanding that self-sufficiency was something that was going to be achieved within a matter of months.
Oh yes, I did see that. And it was a great surprise to me.
That, on any view, was incorrect.
Yes. Yes.
So either his recollection is wrong, although it's right to note and others can read Sir Joseph's statement. It's a matter he explains why it's his recollection, and it's consistent with evidence he gave us elsewhere. So either his recollection is wrong or the committee was misinformed. There's no other way of looking at it. Would you agree?
I don't understand why he came to that conclusion, and what's apparently, I mean, you have some minutes and so on, but I don't know who would have said that. I can't think actually of anybody who knew anything about the position that we were in, given that we were reliant for 50% of our factor 8 concentrates on imports. How anyone could have concluded that self-sufficiency was just a matter of months away, I don't know, and I would be astonished if anybody in the department at official level would have said that.
And then I just want to look at the last sentence of this paragraph, paragraph 4. The subcommittee was also informed that the UK Haemophilia Centre directors have adopted a policy for use of US factor 8 in order to minimise risks as far as possible. Now, just pausing there, any information about that, would you agree, is most likely to have come from Professor Bloom? That would have been the source of the subcommittee's...
Yes, I expect so, yes.
And then I just want to put up on screen, can we do this side by side? So could we have that page on one side, and then WIT... Oh, you're ahead of me. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Read my mind.
Right.
We've got there the letter of the 24th of June 1983, which I know you're familiar
Yes.
with, and indeed we can
Yes.
see the top of the page. It says, please copy to Dr. Walford for info, handwritten at the top of that page.
Yes.
This is the only policy for use, as far as we understand it, and I think as far as you understand it,
Yes.
adopted for use by UK Haemophilia Centre directors.
Yes.
You've referred to these recommendations that we see at 1 and 2 in your witness statement, and you, I think in the context of discussing clinical freedom, you referred to them, I think, as weak recommendations or words to that effect.
Well, I think by definition, because they were recommendations and not guidance or anything more formal, then inevitably that was weak. Essentially, people were free to take or leave the recommendations. But you would have thought that given a letter like this, a great deal of account would be taken of it. I would have been surprised if that were not the policies adopted by the Haemophilia Centre directors. I personally think the most problematic thing is, what about people being treated outside haemophilia centres, and how far did this set of recommendations emanate to places where the haemophiliacs were not known and were only occasionally had to visit for concentrate or other preparations.
But in any event, if we just look at the terms of the recommendations on that right-hand side, we can see in the paragraph numbered 1 which is concerned with mild haemophilia von Willebrand's, and it's simply consider treatment with DDAVP, and a reference to that being, in any case, the usual practice of many directors. And I should say, Dr. Walford, the inquiry's heard inconsistent evidence in relation to usage of DDAVP, even by 1983. So that's considered DDAVP for those categories. And then 2 is children and mildly affected patients or previously untreated patients. All it says is many directors already reserve supplies of, and I think we need to read that as NHS concentrates or cryoprecipitate, and it would be circumspect to continue this policy. So at best, it's a good idea to carry on doing this.
That's right.
You're already doing it. Now, if we just look then on the left-hand side to what the subcommittee's understanding appears to be, and there's no evidence the subcommittee had this letter for it to consider for itself.
No.
The subcommittee says, it's the paragraph 4 on the left-hand side, last sentence. Sorry, no, it's paragraph 4, Shemik. So top of the page. The subcommittee was also informed, hypothesis by Professor Bloom, that the UK Haemophilia Centre directors have adopted a policy for use of factor VIII in order to minimise risks as far as possible. I'm really asking for your view as an informed observer, as I say, because you weren't a decision maker in this regard. Do you think that the policy that, as a matter of fact, had been adopted by Haemophilia Centre directors could accurately be described as a policy for use of factor VIII concentrates that would minimise risks as far as possible? Because the actual policy didn't go very far at all, did it?
No, it was advisory. It recommended. It was in no way mandatory. And I think I stick by the word that I used in my statement, which said that it was weak.
Because a policy, to use the subcommittee's words, for use of US factor VIII to minimise risks as far as possible, bearing in mind the subcommittee has already recognised that those at greatest risk are those who receive high amounts of concentrates, who are most likely to be severely affected haemophiliacs, who are not covered by the policy in the letter of the 24th of June at all, unless they're newly diagnosed patients. A policy to minimise risks as far as possible, minimise use concentrates to minimise risks as far as possible for severe haemophiliacs, would have to be different, wouldn't it? It would have to be something along the lines of no prophylaxis, reduce home treatment.
I understand what you're saying now.
Treat in emergency circumstances, cancel elective surgery, single batch, single concentrate dedication policies.
Absolutely, but that, of course, was not what the meeting of the 13th of September concluded. And there they were suggesting no change for people who had been obviously severe haemophiliacs. That consistently appeared to be the policy of the UKHCDO for quite a long time. So I guess I had assumed, and you're quite right to say it doesn't say that what they were talking about here is how do you stop people who shouldn't be getting concentrate because they're not severe from getting concentrate? Well, there's a set of recommendations, if you like, and asking people to consider what you should do. It doesn't relate to severe haemophiliacs, and my understanding at the time was that because they were all maintained on concentrate, that there was no change in the policy of the UKHCDO.
And so that it's clear, I'm fairly confident you understand this in any event, Dr. Walford. The concern I am ventilating through this line of discussion with you is a concern that the subcommittee may have proceeded on a degree of false reassurance or mistaken reassurance that things were being done in terms of treatment policies that were not being done. That's the reason for raising it. I suspect you can't assist us any further with that because you don't have an independent recollection as an observer.
I have no independent recollection of this meeting.
If I may, this particular paragraph is all about risk, isn't it? It talks about the level of risk not at present justifying withdrawing US product. And then the next three sentences deal with risk. And they throw into the equation to assess what the risk actually is the sense that when and if we become self-sufficient in making our own concentrate, then the risks of US concentrate will by definition fall away. We'll have our own risks, but we won't have the USA's risks.
Yes.
And the second part is that there's been a change of a policy which ensures that the risk is kept as low as possible. In terms of the first of those 2 points, the context was that of what was possibly a transmissible agent that was thought to be the most likely cause. You yourself thought it was the most likely cause, which, if it was something which had a long incubation period, which was understood at the time, might take a while to manifest itself in the way that epidemics do.
Yes.
So the sense that in a year or 2 or 3 or 4's time there might be sufficient production domestically really had nothing to say about that risk, did it?
No, the risk as they were defining it was what they perceived as the risk at present time. Yeah.
And the future production of self-sufficiency, enough quantities, unless it was very, very imminent,
Yes.
would have nothing to say on.
No, it does appear to be another non sequitur.
Yes, it's another non sequitur.
Yes.
And the last looks like misinformation, the sense that there's been a change when there hasn't been a change.
Yes.
Because the general message being sent out from, as I understand, your view of, and at the moment it may well become my own view of what is said in the letter of 24th of June, is that the UK HCDO weak recommendations really were business as usual.
Or slight improvement on business as usual, if you like, emphasising how best practice.
It gives a nudge.
Best practice.
Yes, thank you.
And then if we just go back to the document on the left-hand side and look at paragraph 5, and it's the last paragraph in the subcommittee's conclusions I need to ask you to look at. So this is dealing with the dumping issue, the March 1983 FDA regulations. And the committee say this: it's advisable that all clotting factor concentrates derived from US plasma sources and intended for use in the UK be prepared only from material manufactured from plasma collected after new regulations were introduced by the FDA on March 23rd, 1983. These regulations were introduced specifically to minimise the likelihood of collecting blood from affected donors. This step is recommended, notwithstanding the possibility that its practical value may be relatively small. It cannot, however, be taken until supplies of post-March 23rd material can be assured. It's recommended that close contact is maintained between the licensing authority and supplies division with the aim of introducing this step immediately it becomes feasible. So is it right to understand that what the subcommittee wanted action to be taken in relation to not having pre-March 1983 concentrates in use in the UK, but were articulating the view that there needed to be sufficient supplies of post-March material for that to happen?
Yes, I mean, I think they were still making the point that really, potentially, the benefit of that might be marginal, but notwithstanding that, it would be a good thing to do, but you could only do it once you knew you had adequate supplies, so that you didn't go get the threat that I have been referring to of problems for patients with haemophilia who were not going to be adequately treated if we didn't have enough factor VIII.
Now, I then just want to pick up a handful of bits and pieces of material that follow on from this in terms of chronology before lunch, and then I'll come to some other topics after lunch. So if we can go to DHSC 0002229_097. This is a minute from you dated the 20th of July 1983 to Mr Wrigglesworth and Miss Spencer. It refers to a telex received from the British Embassy, and questions have been raised in America that were then being passed back via the British Embassy to the International Division within the Department of Health about was the UK going to ban American concentrates. And if we need to pick that up, we can do so in due course. I just wanted to ask you about the fourth paragraph that we see on the page. Incidentally, you say, are you happy with the assurances so glibly given by the manufacturers that future supplies of factor VIII will be derived from plasma taken in accordance with the 23rd of March regulations? And then you ask whether more information should be obtained. So it would appear that you're expressing a degree of cynicism, maybe an unfair word.
Scepticism.
Scepticism, that's the word, thank you, as to whether the assurances given that we looked at in that exchange of communications with Mr Edgerton could simply be taken at face value.
Yes, I mean, I thought it would have been helpful for them to have told us when we could have supplies actually in the country from material produced in compliance with the FDA regulations. And I was simply probing the issue and asking for it to be probed.
And then if we could go to DHSC 0002353_020. This is a minute from you dated the 25th of July 1983. Again, it refers to a telex from the British Embassy in Washington. We've got various of those materials, but I don't think it's necessary to go to them with you, Dr. Walford, in order to understand the issues you were raising. You say this: I suggested we should ascertain the outcome of a recent FDA meeting. Just wasn't that? Do you think that's a reference to the 19th of July meeting that we looked at earlier?
I couldn't be sure. What was the date of this? Was
25th
of July?
Of July.
It could be.
In any event, you carry on, which was, I believe, to discuss the problem of plasma/finished product, which predated the 23rd of March regulations. So still concerned with the dumping issue. If there isn't to be no restriction on the use of this material in the USA, I suggest that we should follow the same line. If, however, use of this material is restricted in some way, e.g. by the imposition of a quarantine period, then provided supplies are not prejudiced, the UK should presumably refuse to accept material that is not considered acceptable for use in the States. You agree to take this forward with Dr. Fowler. Why was it your view that the UK should follow the US line rather than ploughing its own furrow?
I am now, of course, trying to think what I may have thought at the time, but I suspect that what I thought was, if the FDA, which had introduced quite stringent regulations to control the product, if you like, and in America they were seeing far more cases, well, still not a huge amount, but maybe up to maybe 17 or something around this time of cases in haemophiliacs, I took the view, I believe, that the FDA would not continue to allow the use of product that they thought to be unsafe, that it would be rather odd if they did, because I knew them to be a very stringent sort of regulator. So if they were saying, we still think you can use this material, well then we did not have more evidence than they had that we shouldn't go on using that material. The big problem is if they restricted it in some way, the chances were that there would be dumping of their material into the UK. So we really needed to be very careful. If the Americans were not going to use this product, it certainly couldn't be allowed to find its way into the UK. But I think that would have been part of my thinking.
And I understand absolutely the second part of what you've said. If the Americans think it's unsafe, we certainly shouldn't be using it. But can I just put this to you? Just because the Americans think it's safe doesn't mean that the UK should reach the same judgment.
Of course it doesn't mean the UK can't have its independent judgment, but thus far, and the date of this is 25th of July, the Committee on Safety of Medicines, biologics subcommittee on which one relied, however much in looking back now you feel it was a flawed meeting. I had nothing more to go on, and neither did anybody else, than their recommendation that actually the material should continue, well, not continue in use, it wasn't specifically said, but that it would not be restricted until supplies could be as it were, confirmed. There was nothing else apart from the CSM's decision that I or any of my colleagues could possibly have gone on. They were advising the licensing authority. The licensing authority did not say we will withdraw these products. So that was all one had to go on.
Just on the question of what steps might practically have been available and subject to whatever the unknown practical difficulties were that Ms Spencer referred to in the department's own meeting of the 3rd of June. But on the question of labelling, stop orders, the kind of issues floated by Dr. Fowler, there's no express reference to them, obviously, in the Committee on the Safety of Medicines conclusions on the 13th of July. So we don't, I think, know whether any consideration was given to the specifics on that occasion. Who might be able to cast further light on that matter, Dr. Walford? Would it be a question for Dr. Duncan Thomas at NIBSC?
NIBSC could say whether or not any restrictions, any new labelling requirements were placed on the products, and the Medicines Division would have been the division to pursue this, to actually push if they felt that it was the thing that they wanted, that they needed to do. I would not have said that for MedSEB, and me in particular, that I had a particular role in following up this state of affairs, though clearly somebody asked my view, and my view was if the Americans weren't going to use it, we certainly shouldn't. But if they were prepared to, and knowing the FDA's rigour, or what I believe to be the FDA's rigour as a regulator, I thought that it was reasonable to go on using it ourselves.
And then if we just pick that up with a slightly later minute from you, 3rd of August 1983, at DHSC 0002351_017. So we can see in the first main paragraph that information's been gathered about the extent of manufacturers' stocks in the UK. And it's recorded that in the case of 3 of the manufacturers, all or a substantial proportion of the stocks being manufactured from plasma collected in accordance with the special precautions instituted by the manufacturers themselves, albeit prior to the March 1983 FDA requirements. So there's is this right? There's a substantial proportion of pre-March plasma in the UK.
Yes.
Not yet used.
Yes.
Your suggestion is, because 3 of the manufacturers are saying that they had their own regime of measures, someone should do the exercise of seeing whether what they were doing was as good as...
That's right.
That's the way of putting it, the
Yes.
FDA recommendations or not.
Yes.
And then the next paragraph, you then say the question is then, what, if any, actions required in relation to stocks of pre-March 1983 material which have not been collected under the manufacturer's own special requirements? Clearly, it's crucial to know the results of the congressional hearing before making any decisions. And you obviously knew by then that this was a matter that was going to be considered by Congress in the States. If by some mischance the hearing should overturn the FDA decision, we shall be on the horns of a very nasty dilemma. Can I ask you, please, why you characterised it in those terms, mischance and horns of a very nasty dilemma? Because Congress might overturn it because it thought that was the right and safe course to take for the protection of its citizens.
I, of course, now don't know precisely what I was thinking, but my thought, I suspect, will have been, we have just had a decision by the Committee on Safety of Medicines and the Licensing Authority which says do not withdraw. We have just heard that the FDA is not proposing withdrawal, as it were. And it's now going to be debated in Congress. Congress is, of course, full of politicians. It's not actually full of experts. And they may choose to overturn something that an expert group has decided, and our own expert group has decided. In that case, we would be finding ourselves, if the American, my thesis was, if the Americans won't take this material, then neither should we. But that would have been based on the science. Here we were having Congress coming in on whatever basis, I don't know, but definitely a political decision. And potentially we would find ourselves with a whole new area of problems that we had to deal with. I think that's all I was probably saying. I couldn't get my head around what we were going to do if Congress decided something different from what had already been agreed.
And then just finally, before lunch, to round off this issue, DHSC 40207 is a minute written by you on the 20th of September 1983. The second paragraph refers to the congressional hearing which has now taken place. It didn't give rise to any alteration in the position in the USA. The FDA decision to allow the use of such material still stands. There would therefore appear to be no reason to change our policy over the use of such material in the UK. So you're essentially consistent with what you previously said. We'll follow the US line. Just bearing in mind that what the biological subcommittee on the 13th of July had actually said was it did want steps to be taken to prevent the use of pre-March plasma, provided that the position of supply could be secured.
Yes.
Did that ever get resolved, to your knowledge?
Well, we know that the supply couldn't be resolved, though, of course, fortunately, there was some material that was made by manufacturers according to their own specifications, which you sent me last night, the Alpha pharmaceutical manufacturers' press release on this and so on, where it was saying how it was taking its steps to protect, to, as it were, follow the FDA guidance, although it was before the FDA guidance was actually promulgated. So there was some material which could have been used as safely as the FDA mandated material would be. But basically the supply position remained exactly as it was when the CSM considered it. We had something like 40 million international units of factor VIII in the country, some of which had been, it seems, manufactured in a way which was, to a degree, if not compliant with the FDA, actually possibly even more rigorous in the case of some of the manufacturers. But the rest wasn't. And so that was the supply that we had. And the Committee on Safety of Medicines, and therefore the licensing authority, had not said that we shouldn't use that material.
And would it be right to understand that in the absence of a labelling process or something equivalent, the haemophilia clinicians who were actually using these concentrates to treat their patients would have no means of knowing whether it was pre or post-March, pre or post the manufacturer's own internal regime?
Yes.
And then just finally, we see you say this. Incidentally, if you haven't already heard, a haemophiliac in Bristol has died of AIDS. And then you refer to material alpha and immuno, also BPL, also cryoprecipitate, and you say there he was a mild haemophiliac. You'll recall, Dr. Walford, when we looked at the Reference Centre Directors meeting of the 13th of May, the reference in the minutes to keeping the matter under constant review, or words to that effect. And you'll recall Dr. Krask saying in his letter to his colleague at the PHLS, well, if another case comes along, then perhaps the balance of risk, as it were, would change. Did the departments approach or the steps that it was taking change at all once the department became aware, as you obviously were by this time, that a haemophiliac had died? And you're no doubt from this minute, there doesn't appear to be any doubt in your mind that the cause is AIDS as a result of treatment with concentrates.
My understanding about this unfortunate man was that he had died in August. CDSC had not been informed, and therefore, I'm not sure what the date of this thing is. It's
20th of September.
Right. So, but by September, CDSC had heard about it. I then reported it or mentioned it at, now I've forgotten whether it was the HCDO meeting or a transfusion director meeting, but certainly it was discussed. And of course then, well, you're probably going to come on to this afternoon to various reports in the press, but what this case was a patient hitherto unknown to us at all as actually potentially ill with AIDS, not having been notified, came to CDSC's attention in September and was immediately reported to, I think it was the HCDO meeting, or I think it was. So in the fact of the death, unfortunate though it was not the newsworthy, if I can put it that way, without giving any possible offence. That was not the issue. The issue was there was a patient with AIDS that we hadn't known about, who had obviously been ill for quite some time. The actual fact that he had unfortunately succumbed to his illness didn't change the issue. It was the fact that there was a case of a haemophiliac, and as we can see, alas, a mild haemophiliac who had actually developed AIDS. That was the important issue. And then the question, I think, your question you're posing to me is, well, I had said previously, if there is a single case of a patient, but it was in fact who had received NHS concentrate that was the concern that I had expressed in that earlier meeting. Here we see that he had received both prophylate and cryobilin, and he'd also had some BPL factor 8, but clearly you would implicate the American factor 8. So I'm not sure that the situation then materially changed, because what I was saying in the earlier correspondence was that if there is a case that has only received BPL factor 8, then that would probably change the whole complexion of things.
I understand that this might have why this raised questions for the adequacy of the surveillance,
yes,
because it wasn't known by CDSC. Just as a matter of fact, I think you've answered the question why, but just to get it on the record as a matter of fact, this information about what was now obviously a second confirmed case,
yes,
whereas previously it had been identified as a possible case, that didn't lead to any particular meeting discussion, a consideration of any new or different policy, did it?
no.
May I just ask, in the same vein, the inquiry not long ago was examining the Trelaws School, and one of the pieces of information which I picked up was that on the 29th of June, Dr. Hill at the Birmingham Children's Hospital was told that one of his patients who was at Trelaws was exhibiting the stigmata of AIDS.
Right.
Did that information ever reach you?
No.
And should it have done?
Well, it shouldn't necessarily have reached me. It should have reached CDSC, and CDSC should have reported it to IMCD.
So there may be a problem for us to look at as to the extent to which the surveillance was actually picking up cases that it should have picked up.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I've trespassed into everyone's lunch. I'm sorry, but now is obviously the right moment to take a break for lunch.
Yes, it is. So we'll take a break until 2:15.